60 years old. No money, no family waiting for them. Just an old wagon carrying worn tools and seeds that might not even sprout. October 1886, Reno County, Kansas. The prairie stretched as far as the eye could see, flat and indifferent like a frozen sea. The neighbors looked and saw two old people trying to start from nothing on land that broke young men. Some offered early condolences. Others bet winter would arrive before the first harvest. Nature doesn't negotiate with age, doesn't forgive tired bodies. And when you start too late, each passing day isn't progress. It's just one more day before the cold comes. Ida and Vernon Haskell had 6 months, maybe less, and the clock was already running. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country. I read every comment. They came from Illinois, not from wealth, not from comfort, but from the kind of slow erosion that happens when you work your whole life and still end up with nothing to show for it. Vernon had been a mill worker for 38 years, 38 years of dust in his lungs and splinters in his hands. Ida had cleaned houses, mended clothes, took in washing when the work was there. They lived in a rented room above a tailor's shop that smelled like old wool and lamp oil. They had no children, no land, no legacy, just each other and the growing certainty that if they stayed, they would die in that room, forgotten. The decision came quietly, no grand announcement, just Vernon looking up one evening from the newspaper, finger resting on an advertisement. Free land, Kansas, Homestead Act still open. Ida looked at him across the table. The lamplight made the lines in his face deeper, the gray in his beard more pronounced. She was 60. He was 61. They both knew what people would say. They said it anyway when Vernon filed the claim at the land office, when they sold what little furniture they had, when they loaded the wagon in the cold pre-dawn of early October. Foolish, desperate, pathetic. The train west was cramped and loud, filled with families and young couples clutching babies and dreams that still felt possible. Ida and Vernon sat near the back, quiet among the noise. Through the window the landscape changed slowly. Trees thinned, the earth flattened, the sky grew impossibly wide, pressing down like something you could drown in. When they finally stepped off at the depot in Hutchinson, the wind hit them immediately, not cold yet, but sharp, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust that settled in the throat. They bought what they could afford: a sack of seed corn, a bag of potatoes, nails, a small axe, salt pork wrapped in brown paper. The man at the general store watched them with the expression of someone who had seen this before and knew how it ended. Vernon paid in coins counted out carefully on the counter. Ida said nothing. They loaded the wagon and drove south toward the claim, following directions written on a scrap of paper. The land, when they reached it, was nothing. Just earth and sky and wind, no trees, no water nearby, no house, no barn, no fence, just 160 acres of tall grass, swaying in waves that looked like the ocean Ida had only seen once, years ago, as a child. Vernon climbed down from the wagon slowly, his knees stiff from the ride. He stood there, hat in hand, looking out at what they had claimed. Ida stayed on the seat, her hands still gripping the reins even though the horse had stopped. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something heavier. The kind of weight that settles when you realize there is no turning back, that the bridges behind you have already burned. That first night, they slept under the wagon. Vernon laid out the blankets while Ida unpacked the food. They ate cold biscuits and drank water from a canteen that tasted like metal. Above them, the stars were so thick they looked like spilled salt. The silence was enormous, not peaceful, just vast, empty. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, high and lonesome. Vernon coughed, the same wet cough he'd had for months. Ida didn't say anything about it. She pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning they met the nearest neighbors, the Callahan family, a quarter-mile east. William Callahan was maybe 40, with a weathered face and hands like leather. His wife, Ruth, stood in the doorway of their sod house with a baby on her hip and 2 small children clinging to her skirts. When Vernon introduced himself and Ida, William nodded slowly, his eyes moving from their faces to the wagon, to the empty claim beyond. "You folks planning to build before winter?" His tone wasn't unkind, just factual. Vernon said they were. William glanced at his wife. Something passed between them, pity, maybe, or just recognition of a hard truth. "Winter comes early out here," Ruth said quietly, "and it stays long." They didn't offer help, but they didn't refuse it either, just a kind of cautious distance, the way you might watch someone walk toward a cliff, knowing you can't stop them but unwilling to look away. Ida thanked them for their time. Vernon tipped his hat. They drove back to their claim in silence. The work began immediately. Vernon marked the corners of where the house would be. 12 feet by 14 feet. Modest, small enough to heat, if they could gather enough fuel. The problem was materials. There were no trees. Lumber cost money they didn't have. So they would have to cut sod, like the Callahans. Strips of earth held together by the roots of prairie grass, stacked like bricks. Vernon had read about it. He had never done it. He took the spade and drove it into the ground. The earth resisted. The grass roots were thick, woven together like iron. He leaned his weight into it, felt his back protest, his shoulders burn. He cut one strip, then another. By midday, he had 6. Ida worked beside him, using a smaller spade to clear rocks, to level the ground where the foundation would be. Her hands blistered within the first hour. She didn't stop. By evening they had cut maybe 20 strips of sod. Nowhere near enough. Vernon sat on the ground, breathing hard, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cooling air. Ida brought him water. He drank without looking at her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too beautiful for how ugly the work felt. She sat beside him, her own body aching in ways she hadn't felt in years. They didn't talk about how slow it was going. They didn't talk about the winter. They just sat there, 2 old people on a piece of land that didn't care if they lived or died, and watched the light fade. That night, the temperature dropped. Not freezing, but enough to make them pull the blankets close. Vernon coughed again, longer this time, deep in his chest. Ida lay beside him, staring up at the underside of the wagon, and felt the weight of it all pressing down. 60 years old, 6 months until winter, and they had barely started. The days blurred together after that. Wake before dawn, work until the light failed, sleep under the wagon, or when the wind was too strong, huddled inside it. Vernon cut sod. Ida stacked it. They developed a rhythm born not from skill, but from necessity. Cut, carry, stack. Cut, carry, stack. The house rose slowly, 1 strip at a time, walls thick and heavy and smelling of damp earth. It didn't look like much. It didn't need to. It just needed to stand. By the 3rd week they had 3 walls. The fourth was slower. Vernon's hands had split open in several places, the cracks deep enough that they bled when he gripped the spade. Ida tore strips from an old petticoat and wrapped them, but the blood soaked through by midday. He didn't complain. Complaining used energy they couldn't spare. She boiled water over a small fire made from dried grass and buffalo chips they'd collected from the prairie. The smell was acrid, unpleasant, but it burned. That was enough. The roof was the hardest part. They needed timber for the frame, but timber meant money, and money was nearly gone. Vernon rode the wagon into Hutchinson, a trip that took most of a day. He came back with 6 rough-cut beams, the cheapest the mill had, and a coil of rope. It cost $4. They had 7 left. Ida didn't ask how they would buy food for the winter. She already knew the answer. They wouldn't. Not much, anyway. They would make do. Together they hauled the beams into place. Vernon climbed onto the uneven sod walls, his legs shaking with the effort. Ida handed the beams up one at a time, her arms burning, her back screaming in protest. It took 2 days to get the frame set. Then they laid more sod across the top, thick and heavy, pressing down on the beams until the whole structure groaned. When it was finished, the roof sagged in the middle. It wasn't straight. It wasn't pretty. But it was shelter. November came cold and gray. The wind shifted, blowing now from the north, carrying with it the smell of something distant and frozen. Vernon dug a shallow well near the house, breaking through layers of hard clay with a post-hole digger that jarred his bones with every strike. 6 feet down, the earth was still dry. 8 feet, and there was dampness. 10 feet, and water began to seep in, slow and brown. It wasn't much. It would have to be enough. Ida rigged a bucket on a rope and pulled up water that tasted like iron and dirt. She boiled it before drinking. Even then it left a film on the tongue. They planted nothing that first month. It was too late. The ground was already hardening with the cold. The seed corn they'd brought sat in a sack inside the sod house waiting for spring, if they made it to spring. Ida tried not to think about that. She focused instead on the tasks in front of her, patching the gaps in the sod walls where wind whistled through, gathering more buffalo chips for fuel, rationing the salt pork and potatoes, making the days smaller, manageable, one at a time. The neighbors came once more, not the Callahans this time, but a man named Edgar Pruitt, who farmed a claim 2 miles west. He rode up on a gray horse, slow and deliberate, and sat there looking at the sad little sod house with its crooked roof and smoke leaking from the gaps. Vernon stepped outside, wiping his hands on his trousers. Pruitt nodded, but didn't dismount. Heard there was an old couple out here trying to prove up. His voice was flat, not unkind, but not warm either. Just stating facts. Thought I'd see for myself. Vernon said they were managing. Pruitt looked past him toward Ida, who stood in the doorway, her face shadowed. "Winter's gonna be hard this year," Pruitt said. "Felt it in the air since September. You folks got food stored?" Vernon said they had some. Pruitt nodded slowly, his eyes moving over the claim, the empty land, the lack of a barn or livestock or anything that might suggest survival. "Some," he repeated, almost to himself. Then he looked back at Vernon, and his expression changed. Not pity, something closer to resignation. "Well, good luck to you both." He turned the horse and rode off without waiting for a reply. Ida came out after he was gone. What did he want? Vernon shook his head. Just looking? She stood beside him, watching the empty horizon where Pruitt had disappeared. They think we're going to die out here." Vernon didn't answer, because she was right. They did think that, and maybe they weren't wrong. That night, Ida cooked the last of the salt pork. They ate in silence, sitting on the dirt floor of the sod house, the fire crackling weakly in the corner. The walls seemed to close in, heavy and damp, smelling of earth and smoke. Vernon's cough had gotten worse. He tried to hide it, turning his face away, but she heard it in the dark, deep and rattling. She wanted to say something, to ask if he was all right, but the question felt pointless. Neither of them was all right. They were just still breathing. The next week, Vernon began building a small lean-to against the side of the house. Not for them, for tools, for the few supplies they had left. He used scrap wood and more sod, working slowly, his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. Ida helped when she could, but more often she spent her time walking the prairie, gathering anything that could burn. Dried grass, thistle, stalks, old branches from a creek bed 1/2 mile south. She filled a sack and dragged it back, her shoulders aching, her breath coming hard. She was 60 years old. Her body reminded her of this every single day. By mid-November, the lean-to was finished. It wasn't much, just a slanted roof and 3 walls. But it kept the wind off the tools, kept the snow from piling on the seed corn. Vernon stood back and looked at it, hands on his hips, breathing hard. Ida stood beside him. Neither of them smiled. There was nothing to smile about. It was just one more thing that might help them survive. Might. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the eastern horizon. Ida saw him first, a dark shape, moving slow across the flat land. She called to Vernon, who was inside trying to patch a leak in the roof. He came out, shading his eyes against the low sun. They watched together as the rider approached. It was William Callahan. He stopped a few yards from the house and dismounted. In his hands, he carried a burlap sack. He held it out toward Vernon without ceremony. "Potatoes," he said. "We had extra." Vernon hesitated. Pride is a strange thing. Even when you're starving, it fights back. But Ida stepped forward and took the sack. It was heavy, maybe 20 pounds. She met Callahan's eyes. "Thank you." He nodded, already turning back to his horse. "Don't thank me. Thank my wife. She's the one who insisted." He climbed back into the saddle and rode off, not waiting for more words. Inside, Ida opened the sack. The potatoes were small, some bruised, but they were food. Real food. Enough for weeks if they were careful. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not relief. Something closer to shame. They were taking charity. They had become the kind of people others pitied. Vernon sat on the floor, staring at the potatoes, his jaw tight. "We'll pay them back," he said quietly. Ida didn't answer. She didn't know how they would. She just closed the sack and set it in the corner, away from the damp. The days grew shorter. The sun set earlier, rose later. The work didn't stop, but it slowed. Vernon's cough worsened. Some mornings he could barely stand. Ida boiled water with wild herbs she'd found near the creek, trying to make something that might help. It didn't. He drank it anyway, because she'd made it, because refusing felt like giving up. By late November, the first snow came. Not much. Just a dusting that melted by midday. But it was a warning. Winter was no longer coming. It was here, and they were not ready. Not even close. Ida stood outside the sod house, watching the white flakes fall against the gray sky, and felt the weight of it settle over her like a second skin. They had survived the first month. Barely. And the hardest part hadn't even started yet. December arrived with a stillness that felt wrong, the kind of quiet that makes animals nervous. that sits heavy in the chest, like a held breath. The sky turned the color of old iron, low and pressing, and the wind died completely. Vernon stood outside the sod house on the morning of December 4th, looking north. The air smelled different, sharp, metallic, like blood or cold steel. He'd felt weather like this once before, years ago in Illinois. It had torn half the roofs off the town. He went inside and told Ida to bring everything loose into the house. She didn't ask why. She just started moving. They worked quickly. Tools from the lean-to, the sack of seed corn, the remaining potatoes, the coil of rope, the bucket, anything that could blow away or break. Vernon nailed a board across the door from the inside, wedging it tight. The single window, just a frame covered with oiled paper, he reinforced with an old crate. Ida filled every container they had with water from the well. If the storm was bad, they wouldn't be able to go outside for days. When they were finished, they sat on the floor in the dim light and waited. The wind started just after noon, not gradually, all at once, a low roar that built and built until it sounded like a living thing, howling and clawing at the walls. The sod house shuddered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The oiled paper over the window snapped and tore, and cold air poured in. Vernon stuffed rags into the gap, pressing them tight, but the wind found every crack, every seam, every weakness. The temperature inside dropped fast. Ida wrapped herself in both blankets, shivering. Vernon fed the fire with dried grass, trying to keep it alive, but the wind sucked the heat away almost as fast as it formed. By nightfall, the snow came. Not falling, driving, horizontal. It pounded against the walls like fists, piling against the door, sealing them in. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that made thinking difficult, made speaking pointless. Vernon sat with his back against the wall, coughing into his fist. Ida watched him in the flickering firelight, his face pale, his breathing labored. She wanted to tell him to lie down, to rest, but there was nowhere to rest that wasn't freezing. So they sat and waited and listened to the storm try to kill them. The first crack came sometime after midnight, a sharp sound, like a gunshot, loud enough to cut through the wind. Vernon's head snapped up. They both stared at the ceiling. For a moment, nothing. Then another crack, longer, splintering. One of the roof beams was breaking. Vernon scrambled to his feet, grabbed one of the support posts they'd placed in the center of the room, and braced it harder against the sagging roof. The beam groaned but held, barely. Ida moved to the other side, pressing her weight against the wall, as if her body could hold back the storm. The wind screamed, the house shook, and they stood there, frozen, waiting to see if the roof would come down on top of them. It held, through the night, through the endless howling, through the cold that seeped into their bones and made every breath painful. It held, but just barely. By morning, the wind had lessened, though it hadn't stopped. Vernon moved the board away from the door and pushed. It didn't budge. Snow had piled against it, packed solid. He pushed harder, his shoulders screaming in protest, and finally the door cracked open a few inches, enough to see outside. The world was white, completely white. Snow covered everything, drifted in waves like a frozen ocean, and the lean-to was gone. Not damaged. Gone. The wind had torn it apart, scattered the pieces across the prairie. The tools that had been inside were buried somewhere under the snow. The seed corn they'd moved into the house in time. But the rest, the nails, the rope, the small axe, all of it was lost. Vernon stood in the doorway, staring at the wreckage, and felt something break inside him. Not loudly, quietly, like a bone snapping underwater. Ida came up behind him. She saw it and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had lost 2 weeks of work. They had lost materials they couldn't replace, and the winter had only just begun. She touched his arm, lightly, and he turned away from the door. His face was blank, empty. She had never seen him look like that before. It frightened her more than the storm had. They spent the day digging, not for the tools. Those were gone, buried under snow that might not melt until March. They dug to clear a path from the door to the well, to make sure they could still get water. Vernon worked slowly, his movements stiff and pained. The cold had settled into his joints, into his chest. Every breath rattled. Ida tried to take the shovel from him once to give him a rest, but he pulled it back, shaking his head. He needed to do this, needed to feel like he was still capable of something. By evening, they had a narrow trench carved through the snow. Enough to reach the well, enough to survive. They went back inside, closed the door, and sat in the dark. The fire was low. They had burned through most of the fuel during the storm. Tomorrow they would need to go out and find more. But tonight they just sat. Ida's hands were numb. Vernon's cough had turned wet, thick. She listened to him struggle to breathe and felt the enormity of their situation settle over her like a weight she could no longer carry. "We should leave," she said. Her voice was quiet, flat. Vernon didn't look at her. He stared at the fire, at the weak flames barely holding on. "Leave and go where?" he asked. She didn't have an answer. Back to Illinois? To what? The rented room above the tailor's shop? The mill that had broken him piece by piece for 38 years? There was nothing back there. Nothing but the slow death they'd been trying to escape. "We stay," Vernon said finally. It wasn't confidence in his voice, just stubbornness, the kind born from having no other choice. That night, Ida lay awake long after Vernon had fallen into a restless sleep beside her. She could hear the wind still moving outside, quieter now but constant, a reminder that the storm wasn't truly over. It had just paused. She thought about the lean-to, about the tools buried somewhere in the snow, about the seed corn sitting in the corner of the room, waiting for a spring that felt impossibly far away. She thought about Vernon's cough, about the way his hands shook even when he wasn't cold. And she thought about the question she'd asked. We should leave. But she already knew they wouldn't, because leaving meant admitting defeat. And defeat, at 60 years old, looked too much like death. The storm had taken something from them, not just the lean-to, not just the tools. It had taken the illusion that effort alone would be enough, that willpower could overcome age and winter, and a land that didn't care if you lived or died. They had survived the night. But survival, Ida was learning, wasn't the same as winning. It was just another word for not dying yet. And the winter was far from over. December arrived with a stillness that felt wrong, the kind of quiet that makes animals nervous, that sits heavy in the chest like a held breath. The sky turned the color of old iron, low and pressing, and the wind died completely. Vernon stood outside the sod house on the morning of December 4th, looking north. The air smelled different, sharp, metallic, like blood or cold steel. He'd felt weather like this once before, years ago in Illinois. It had torn half the roofs off the town. He went inside and told Ida to bring everything loose into the house. She didn't ask why. She just started moving. They worked quickly. Tools from the lean-to, the sack of seed corn, the remaining potatoes, the coil of rope, the bucket, anything that could blow away or break. Vernon nailed a board across the door from the inside, wedging it tight. The single window, just a frame covered with oiled paper, he reinforced with an old crate. Ida filled every container they had with water from the well. If the storm was bad, they wouldn't be able to go outside for days. When they were finished, they sat on the floor in the dim light and waited. The wind started just after noon, not gradually, all at once. A low roar that built and built until it sounded like a living thing, howling and clawing at the walls. The sod house shuddered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The oiled paper over the window snapped and tore, and cold air poured in. Vernon stuffed rags into the gap, pressing them tight, but the wind found every crack, every seam, every weakness. The temperature inside dropped fast. Ida wrapped herself in both blankets, shivering. Vernon fed the fire with dried grass, trying to keep it alive, but the wind sucked the heat away almost as fast as it formed. The sound of the storm was unlike anything Ida had experienced. It wasn't just wind. It was a physical presence, a violence that seemed personal, targeted. The walls groaned under the pressure. Small bits of sod crumbled from the ceiling, falling like dark snow onto their shoulders, into their hair. She pulled the blanket tighter and watched Vernon struggle to keep the fire going. His hands shook, not from cold alone, from exhaustion, from the months of work that had worn him down to something brittle. By nightfall, the snow came, not falling, driving, horizontal. It pounded against the walls like fists, piling against the door, sealing them in. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that made thinking difficult, made speaking pointless. Vernon sat with his back against the wall, coughing into his fist. Ida watched him in the flickering firelight, his face pale, his breathing labored. She wanted to tell him to lie down, to rest, but there was nowhere to rest that wasn't freezing. So they sat and waited and listened to the storm try to kill them. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to coals. Vernon added more fuel, but their supply was limited. They had maybe enough to last through the night. Maybe, if the storm lasted longer, they would have to choose between freezing and burning the furniture they didn't have. The thought sat between them, unspoken, but understood. Ida closed her eyes and tried to remember warmth. Summer in Illinois, the sun on her face, laundry drying on a line, smelling of soap and heat. It felt like a memory from someone else's life. The first crack came sometime after midnight, a sharp sound like a gunshot, loud enough to cut through the wind. Vernon's head snapped up. They both stared at the ceiling. For a moment, nothing. Then another crack, longer, splintering. One of the roof beams was breaking. Vernon scrambled to his feet, grabbed one of the support posts they'd placed in the center of the room, and braced it his harder against the sagging roof. The beam groaned but held, barely. Ida moved to the other side, pressing her weight against the wall, as if her body could hold back the storm. The wind screamed, the house shook, and they stood there, frozen, waiting to see if the roof would come down on top of them. Minutes stretched into hours. Vernon's arms trembled from holding the post. His back burned. His legs went numb. But he didn't let go. Couldn't. If the roof collapsed, they would die. Not from the weight of it, though that might kill them too, but from exposure, from the cold pouring in, from being buried under snow with no way to dig themselves out. Ida watched him, saw the strain in his face, the way his breath came in short gasps. She wanted to help. but there was nothing she could do except stand there and pray that the wood held, that the sod walls didn't crumble, that they would see morning. The beam held. Through the night, through the endless howling, through the cold that seeped into their bones and made every breath painful, it held. But the cost was written on Vernon's face. When the wind finally began to ease just before dawn, he let go of the post and collapsed onto the floor, not dramatically, just a slow sinking, like something deflating. Ida knelt beside him. His skin was gray. His lips had a faint blue tinge. She touched his forehead. It was burning. Fever. The cold and the exertion had pushed his body past its limit. She pulled the blankets over him and tried to warm him with her own body, lying close, wrapping her arms around his shaking frame. He mumbled something she couldn't understand. His eyes were closed, but moving beneath the lids like he was dreaming, or trapped somewhere between sleep and waking. She held him and listened to the storm begin to die outside. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. The snow stopped pounding. Slowly, the world grew quiet again. By morning, the wind had lessened, though it hadn't stopped. Vernon was unconscious, his breathing shallow. Ida moved the board away from the door and pushed. It didn't budge. Snow had piled against it, packed solid. She pushed harder, putting her shoulder into it, and finally the door cracked open a few inches. Enough to see outside. The world was white, completely white. Snow covered everything, drifted in waves like a frozen ocean. And the lean-to was gone, not damaged. Gone. The wind had torn it apart, scattered the pieces across the prairie. The tools that had been inside were buried somewhere under the snow. The seed corn they'd moved into the house in time. But the rest, the nails, the rope, the small axe, the boards Vernon had carefully salvaged and saved. All of it was lost. Ida stood in the doorway, staring at the wreckage, and felt something inside her crack. Not break, just crack, like ice under weight. She closed the door and went back to Vernon. He was still unconscious. She boiled the last of their water and used a rag to wipe his face, his neck, trying to bring the fever down. He didn't wake, didn't respond, just lay there, chest rising and falling in shallow movements that looked too much like dying. She had seen death before. Her mother, her father, a neighbor's child once, from fever that wouldn't break. This looked like that, felt like that. For the first time since they'd arrived in Kansas, Ida cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears that ran down her face and dripped onto Vernon's shirt. She cried because she was tired, because they had lost so much, because the man beside her, the man who had worked himself to nothing trying to build them a future, might not survive to see it. And she cried because she knew, in that moment, that even if he did survive, they might not make it through the winter. The storm had taken more than tools and wood. It had taken their margin for error, their buffer, the thin line between survival and disaster. She wiped her face and stood. Crying wouldn't help, wouldn't bring back the lean-to, wouldn't lower Vernon's fever. She needed to move, to do something. She forced the door open wider, pushing against the snow, and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a fist. Her breath froze in the air. Her fingers went numb almost immediately. She waded through the drifts toward where the lean-to had been, scanning the snow for anything salvageable. A board, a nail, anything. She found a piece of the roof frame, half buried, cracked down the middle but still usable. She pulled it free and dragged it back to the house. Then she went out again, and again. Each time, the cold bit deeper. Each time, her body protested more loudly, but she kept going. because stopping meant accepting that everything was lost, and she wasn't ready for that, not yet. By midday, she had recovered 3 boards, a handful of bent nails, and 1 corner post that had somehow stayed intact. It wasn't much. It wouldn't rebuild the lean-to, but it was something. She brought them inside and stacked them against the wall. Vernon was awake now, barely, his eyes half open and unfocused. She gave him water. He drank a little, most of it spilling down his chin. Then he closed his eyes again and slipped back into whatever dark place the fever had taken him. That night was the longest of Ida's life. She sat beside Vernon, feeding the fire 1 precious handful of fuel at a time, watching his chest rise and fall, counting the breaths to make sure they kept coming. The wind had died completely now, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the storm. Outside, the snow glittered under a clear sky, beautiful and deadly. Inside, the sod house was dark and cold and smelled of sickness and smoke. She thought about the question she'd asked the day before. We should leave. The words felt hollow now, meaningless. They couldn't leave. Not with Vernon like this. Not with winter holding them hostage. They were trapped. Not by choice, but by circumstance, by age, by poverty, by a decision made months ago that had seemed brave at the time, but now felt like the beginning of the end. Sometime after midnight, Vernon's fever broke. His breathing steadied. His skin cooled. Ida felt his forehead and nearly sobbed with relief. He would live, for now. But the storm had taken something from both of them. Not just tools or shelter. It had taken the belief that they could do this, that willpower and effort were enough. The prairie had shown them the truth. It didn't care how hard they worked, didn't care that they were trying. It would take everything they had and ask for more, and when they had nothing left to give, it would take them too. Vernon didn't get out of bed for 3 days. The fever had broken, but it left him hollow, weak, like something essential had been burned out of him. Ida did what she could. She boiled snow for water. She rationed the potatoes, cutting them into smaller and smaller pieces, making them last. She went outside each morning to gather fuel, wading through snow that came up to her thighs, her skirts freezing stiff, her hands so cold they stopped hurting and just went numb. She found dried grass poking through the drifts, old buffalo chips buried under the white. Anything that would burn. She brought it back and fed the fire just enough to keep them from freezing. Just enough. Never more. By the 4th day, Vernon managed to sit up. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He'd lost weight they couldn't afford to lose. Ida helped him to the door so he could see outside, see what the storm had done. He stood there, leaning against the frame, looking at the empty space where the lean-to had been. The snow had started to settle, revealing bits of broken wood scattered across the claim like bones. He didn't say anything, just stood there, breathing hard from the effort of standing, and stared. "We'll rebuild it," Ida said. Her voice was quiet, uncertain. Vernon shook his head slowly. "With what?" he asked. She didn't have an answer. The wood was gone. The nails were buried. They had no money to buy more, no way to get to town, even if they did. The snow had made the roads impassable. They were cut off, alone, and winter had only just begun. December passed in a gray blur. The sun rose late and set early, offering little warmth. The temperature dropped and stayed low, a constant ache in the bones. They burned through their fuel faster than Ida could gather it. Some days the fire went out completely, and they huddled together under the blankets, shivering, waiting for enough light to go back outside and search for more. The potatoes dwindled. By Christmas, they were eating one small potato a day, split between them. It wasn't enough. Hunger became a third presence in the house, quiet and patient and always there. Vernon tried to help. He went outside with Ida, moving slowly, his breath rattling in his chest. But he couldn't keep up, couldn't carry what she carried, couldn't work as long. After an hour, he would have to sit down in the snow, his head between his knees, coughing until his whole body shook. Ida would help him back inside and tell him to rest. He would nod, too tired to argue, too tired to feel ashamed. But the shame was there anyway, written in the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, in the way he turned his face to the wall. By early January, they were burning furniture. The crate that had covered the window, the boards from the lean-to that Ida had salvaged, the bed frame they'd brought from Illinois. They broke it apart, piece by piece, and fed it to the fire. It felt like burning their past, burning the life they'd left behind. Each piece that went into the flames was a memory turned to ash. The bed where they'd slept for 20 years, the table where they'd eaten meals, the chair Vernon had built himself when they were young, all of it, gone, turned into heat that lasted a few hours and then vanished. The hunger grew teeth. It gnawed at them constantly, a dull ache that made thinking hard, made moving harder. Ida's hands trembled when she worked. Her vision blurred at the edges. Vernon stopped getting out of bed most days. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, his face slack, his eyes distant. She tried to make him eat, but he would only take a few bites before pushing the plate away. "You need it more," he would say. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that wasn't true, but she was too tired. So she ate his portion and felt guilty for it, felt like she was stealing from him, from herself, from whatever future they might have left. On January 12th, someone knocked on the door. The sound was so unexpected that Ida thought she'd imagined it. But then it came again, 3 slow knocks. She opened the door and found Ruth Callahan standing there, a basket in her hands. Behind her the snow stretched white and empty. Ruth's face was red from the cold, her breath coming in clouds. She held out the basket without a word. Inside was bread, half a loaf wrapped in cloth, and a jar of preserves, and a small bundle of dried meat. Ida stared at it. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but the words stuck. Ruth shifted her weight, uncomfortable. "William wanted to come," she said quietly. "But he's sick, chest cold. I told him I'd check on you both." Her eyes moved past Ida, into the dark interior of the sod house, and something flickered in her expression. Pity, or maybe just recognition. "How are you managing?" she asked. Ida wanted to lie, wanted to say they were fine, that they didn't need help, that they were strong and capable, and surviving just fine on their own. But the lie wouldn't come. She was too tired, too hungry, too worn down. "Barely," she said. The word came out like a confession. Ruth nodded. She didn't seem surprised. "The storm hit everyone hard," she said. "But it hit you hardest. I know that." She gestured to the basket. "It's not much, but it's something." Ida took the basket. The weight of it felt like salvation and humiliation wrapped together. "We'll pay you back," she said. Ruth shook her head. "Don't worry about that now. Just stay alive. That's payment enough." She turned to leave, then stopped. "If it gets too bad," she said, not looking back, "you come to us. Don't wait until it's too late. You hear?" Ida nodded, though Ruth couldn't see it. Then Ruth walked away, her figure shrinking against the white expanse until she disappeared completely. Inside, Ida set the basket on the floor. Vernon was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching. "Charity," he said. His voice was flat, empty. Ida opened the cloth and broke off a piece of bread. It was still soft, still fresh. She handed it to him. "Charity or not," she said, "we're eating it." He took the bread and stared at it for a long moment. Then he ate, slowly, mechanically, like it hurt to swallow. Maybe it did. That night, with food in their stomachs for the first time in days, they lay side by side in the dark. The fire had died down to coals. The cold pressed in from all sides. Vernon's breathing was easier now, less labored, but there was a heaviness between them that hadn't been there before. A weight that charity brings. The knowledge that they had failed, that they couldn't do this alone, that survival meant accepting help they couldn't repay. "I'm sorry," Vernon said. His voice was barely a whisper. Ida turned to look at him, but she could only see his outline in the dark. "For what?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was thick. "For bringing you here. For thinking we could do this, for not being strong enough to." She cut him off. "Stop." Her voice was sharp, sharper than she intended. She softened it. "We chose this, both of us. Don't take that away from me." He was quiet. She could feel him next to her, the warmth of his body, the rise and fall of his chest. He trailed off. She waited. "I just wanted to give you something," he said finally. "A home. A place that was ours. I wanted." He stopped again. She reached out in the dark and found his hand. It was rough and cracked and cold. She held it. "I know," she said. And she did. She knew what he'd wanted, what they'd both wanted. A piece of land to call their own. A place where their names would be written in the earth, where they would be remembered. It had seemed possible once. Back in Illinois, in that rented room, reading the advertisements. It had seemed like the kind of dream worth chasing. But dreams don't prepare you for winter. Don't prepare you for hunger. For the way your body breaks down. For the humiliation of accepting bread from neighbors who expect you to die. The days that followed were slow and cold. They stretched the food from Ruth's basket as far as it would go. The bread lasted 5 days, the meat another 3. The preserves they saved, eating just a spoonful each evening, making it feel like something special, something to look forward to. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them breathing, to keep them hoping, even if the hope felt thin, fragile, like ice over water. By late January, Vernon could walk again, not far, not for long, but he could move. He went outside with Ida and helped gather fuel. They developed a new rhythm, slower than before, more careful. He couldn't lift what he used to, couldn't work as many hours. But he was trying. That had to count for something. Ida told herself it did, told herself that effort mattered, even when it wasn't enough. Especially when it wasn't enough. The snow began to melt in early February, just a little, revealing the frozen ground beneath. The temperature warmed slightly during the day, though it still dropped below freezing at night. It wasn't spring, not even close. But it was movement, a sign that winter, however brutal, wouldn't last forever. They clung to that, used it to push through the days when everything hurt, when hunger made their hands shake, when the future looked like nothing but more cold and more struggle. One afternoon, as they worked to clear snow from around the house, Vernon stopped suddenly. Ida looked up. He was standing still, his hand pressed to his chest, his face twisted. "What's wrong?" she asked. He shook his head, trying to wave her off, but his legs buckled. He went down hard, kneeling in the snow, gasping for air. Ida dropped the shovel and ran to him. "Vernon, Vernon, look at me." His eyes were wide, scared. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She got him to his feet, half dragging him back to the house, every step an agony for both of them. Inside, she laid him down and loosened his shirt. His breathing came in short, desperate gasps. His lips were turning blue. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix this. She just knelt beside him, holding his hand, whispering things that didn't matter. Stay with me, please." And slowly, his breathing eased. The color came back to his face. He closed his eyes and lay still, exhausted. Ida sat back, her heart pounding. She looked at him, at the frail, broken man lying on the floor of their sod house, and felt the truth settle over her like a shroud. They weren't going to make it. Not both of them. Maybe not either of them. Winter had stripped them down to bone, and even will had its limits. She wiped her face with her sleeve and stood. Then she went outside, into the cold, and screamed, just once, just to let it out. The sound was swallowed by the prairie, absorbed into the snow and the sky and the endless empty land. And when she was done, she went back inside. Because that's what you did. You kept going, even when it was pointless, even when it hurt. You kept going, because stopping meant dying, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. February came with a brief thaw that felt like mercy. The sun appeared for a few days, weak and pale but present, and the snow began to melt in patches. Water ran in thin streams across the frozen ground, pooling in low places, turning the earth to mud. Vernon regained some strength. Not much, but enough to walk without stopping every few steps. Enough to stand without his legs shaking. They took advantage of the thaw, gathered more fuel, checked the well, cleared the drifts from around the house. Small tasks, necessary tasks, tasks that made them feel like they were still fighting. But the thaw didn't last. By mid-February, the cold returned, harder than before. The wind came back, cutting and relentless, and with it came ice. Not snow this time. Ice. It fell as freezing rain that coated everything in a slick, hard shell. The ground became glass. The roof of the sod house grew a skin of ice that cracked and refroze with each shift in temperature. Walking became treacherous. Every step was a calculation. Every movement carried the risk of falling. Vernon fell on February 18th. He'd gone outside to bring in more fuel, moving carefully, his feet testing each step. But the ice was hidden under a thin layer of fresh snow, invisible until it was too late. His foot slipped. He tried to catch himself, but his body was too slow, too worn down. He hit the ground hard, his shoulder taking the impact. The sound was dull and wet, wrong. Ida heard it from inside. She ran out and found him lying on his side, his face twisted in pain, his right arm bent at an angle that made her stomach turn. She helped him up, or tried to. He couldn't use the arm, couldn't lift it, couldn't move it without crying out. She got him inside and laid him down, her hands shaking as she tried to examine the injury. The shoulder was dislocated or broken. She didn't know how to tell the difference, didn't know how to fix either one. All she knew was that Vernon's face had gone gray, that sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cold, and that he was biting his lip hard enough to draw blood. "I need to set it," she said. Her voice sounded strange, distant, like someone else was speaking. Vernon shook his head. You don't know how. She looked at him, looked at the arm. I have to try. He closed his eyes, nodded once. She knelt beside him, placed one hand on his shoulder and the other on his upper arm, and tried to remember what she'd seen done once, years ago, when a farmhand had been hurt. She pulled. Vernon screamed. The sound was ragged and raw, and filled the small space of the sod house like something alive. She pulled harder, felt something shift, and then a pop. Vernon went limp, unconscious. She finished the movement, felt the shoulder slide back into place, and then sat back, shaking so hard she thought she might be sick. When he woke, hours later, the arm was still useless. Limp. He could move his fingers slightly, but lifting the arm was impossible. The pain was constant, a deep throb that radiated through his chest and down his back. Ida fashioned a sling from a torn blanket and tied it around his neck. It helped. A little, but not enough. Vernon lay on the floor, staring at nothing, and didn't speak. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating. The next morning, Ida went outside alone. She had to. Vernon couldn't work, couldn't gather fuel or carry water, or do any of the dozen small tasks that kept them alive. It all fell to her now. She waded through the snow to the well, her legs aching, her breath coming hard. She pulled up the bucket, the rope cutting into her palms, and filled the containers. Then she went searching for fuel. The ice made it harder. Everything was slick and frozen and sharp. She fell twice. The second time she stayed down for a moment, her hands pressed into the snow, her body screaming at her to stop, to just lie there and let the cold take her. It would be easier. Faster, but she pushed herself up, brushed the snow off, kept moving. By midday, she had gathered enough fuel for maybe 2 days. She brought it inside and found Vernon sitting up, trying to tie his boots one-handed. He was fumbling with the laces, his face tight with frustration. She knelt and tied them for him. He didn't thank her, didn't look at her, just stood and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she asked. He didn't answer. He pushed the door open and went outside. She followed. He was standing by the remains of the lean-to, looking at the scattered wood, the broken pieces half buried in ice and snow. "We need to rebuild it," he said. His voice was flat. She stared at him. "You can't even lift your arm." He turned to face her. His eyes were red, tired, angry. "Then what good am I?" he asked. The words hung between them. Ida didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he was still useful, still needed. But the truth was harder, uglier. He couldn't work, couldn't contribute. He was one more weight she had to carry, one more mouth to feed, one more body to keep warm, and they both knew it. The knowledge sat between them like a third person, silent and accusing. She reached for his good hand, but he pulled away. "I'm going to lie down," he said, and he went back inside, leaving her standing there in the cold. The days that followed were the hardest they'd faced, not because of the weather, though that was brutal, not because of the hunger, though that was constant, but because something between them had broken. Not their marriage, not their commitment, but something more fundamental. The partnership, the sense that they were in this together, equally, both pulling the same weight. Now Ida carried everything, the water, the fuel, the food preparation, the repairs, all of it, and Vernon sat inside, his arm in a sling, unable to help, unable to do anything but watch her slowly break under the strain. He tried. He went outside when he could, tried to gather small sticks, one-handed, tried to clear snow with his good arm. But he was slow, clumsy, more hindrance than help. Ida found herself working around him, doing tasks twice because he couldn't do them right the first time. And the resentment grew. She didn't want it to, didn't let herself think about it directly. But it was there, a small, hard seed of anger that she couldn't quite swallow. One evening, as they sat in the dark eating a thin soup made from the last of the potatoes and some wild onions Ida had found, Vernon spoke. "I'm sorry." His voice was quiet, broken. Ida didn't look up. She stirred her soup, watching the steam rise. "For what?" she asked. "For this, for all of it, for being useless." She set her spoon down, looked at him. His face was half hidden in shadow, but she could see the shame there, the self-loathing. "You're not useless," she said. But the words felt hollow, mechanical. He heard it too. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness. "Yes, I am. You do everything. I just sit here and watch you kill yourself." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it wasn't true, but she was too tired, too worn down, so she said nothing, just went back to her soup. The silence stretched. Vernon set his bowl aside, untouched. "Maybe I should leave," he said. Ida's head snapped up. "What?" He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Go back to Hutchinson, find work, send money back." She stared at him. "You can't even use your arm." He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. I'm a burden here. At least there." She cut him off. "At least there. What? You think anyone's going to hire a 61-year-old man with one arm? You think you'll even make it to town in this cold?" He finally looked at her. His eyes were wet. "I don't know what else to do." She felt something crack inside her chest. Not anger, something deeper. Sadder. She reached across the space between them and took his good hand. Held it. "You stay," she said. Her voice was firm, final. "You stay, and you heal, and when spring comes, we try again. That's what you do." He shook his head. "I don't know if I can." She squeezed his hand harder. "You don't have a choice. Neither of us do." That night, they lay in the dark, not touching, each wrapped in their own blanket, their own thoughts. The cold pressed in from all sides. The wind moaned outside, and Ida lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. The work, the hunger, the responsibility, the knowledge that if they survived this winter, it would be because of her. Not both of them, just her. And she didn't know if she was strong enough, didn't know if anyone was, but she couldn't say that, couldn't let Vernon see her doubt. Because if she broke, if she gave up, they both died. So she kept it locked inside, kept moving, kept working, kept carrying the weight alone. And every day, the weight grew heavier. Every day she felt herself bending a little more under it. But she didn't break. Not yet. Because breaking meant stopping, and stopping meant dying. And she wasn't ready. Not yet. By late February, Vernon's shoulder had improved slightly. He could lift his arm a little, could use it for light tasks. But the strength didn't come back. The damage was done. He tried to help more, tried to take some of the burden off Ida, but his efforts were clumsy, painful to watch. She found herself doing things twice. Once when he tried and failed. Once when she had to fix it. It would have been easier if he just stayed inside. But she couldn't say that. Couldn't take that last piece of dignity from him. So they continued. Two old people, broken in different ways, trying to survive a winter that had already taken almost everything they had. The food was nearly gone. The fuel was almost out. The cold showed no signs of leaving, and between them the silence grew thicker, not hostile, just tired. The silence of two people who had fought as hard as they could and were running out of fight. The silence of two people who loved each other but had learned that love, however strong, couldn't make bodies young again, couldn't turn back time, couldn't make impossible things possible. March was coming, spring was coming, but it felt very far away, and neither of them was sure they would make it. March arrived not with warmth, but with wind, a different kind of wind, not the killing cold of winter, but something restless, searching, carrying the faint promise of change. The snow began to melt in earnest, slowly at first, then faster. Water ran in streams across the claim, cutting channels through the mud, pooling in low places. The ice on the roof dripped steadily, a sound that felt almost hopeful. Almost. Ida stood outside one morning, watching the water run, and felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not yet, but the absence of dread, the sense that maybe, just maybe, they had survived the worst. Vernon's shoulder had healed enough that he could use it. Not well, not like before, but enough to hold a shovel, enough to lift small loads, enough to feel like he was contributing again. The shame in his eyes had lessened, replaced by something harder. Determination, or maybe just stubbornness, the refusal to be defeated. They began clearing the debris from the storm, sorting through the wreckage of the lean-to, salvaging what could be saved. It wasn't much. A few boards, some nails bent but usable, but it was something to work with, something to build from. By mid-March, the ground had thawed enough to work. Vernon wanted to rebuild the lean-to, but Ida stopped him. "Not yet," she said. "First we plant." He looked at her, confused. "Plant what?" "We don't have." She went inside and came back with the sack of seed corn, the one they'd saved, protected through the winter, carried into the house during the storm. It was their future, their hope, their only chance. "We plant this," she said, "and we pray it grows." They prepared the ground together. Vernon broke the soil with the spade, working slowly, his shoulder protesting with each thrust. Ida followed behind, raking the earth smooth, pulling out rocks, creating rows. The work was hard. Their bodies were weak from months of hunger and cold, but they kept moving, kept working, because this was why they'd come, why they'd stayed, why they'd survived. For this, for the chance to put seeds in the ground and see them grow. The planting took 3 days. They worked from sunrise to sunset, stopping only when the light failed. Vernon's hands blistered. Ida's back seized up so badly one evening that she couldn't stand straight. But they finished, every seed in the ground, covered with soil, watered from the well. And when it was done, they stood together at the edge of the field, looking at the dark earth, and felt something they hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not satisfaction, just a quiet sense of completion. They had done it. They had made it to spring, and now the rest was up to the land. The neighbors noticed. William Callahan rode by one afternoon and stopped to watch them work. He dismounted and walked to where Vernon was repairing a section of fence with salvaged wood. "Didn't think you'd make it," Callahan said. There was no malice in his voice, just honesty. Vernon straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Neither did we," he admitted. Callahan nodded slowly. "But you did." He looked at the planted field, at the small sod house with its patched roof, at Ida working near the well. "That's something," he said. Then he held out his hand. Vernon took it. They shook. No words. Just that. An acknowledgement. Respect. After Callahan left, Vernon stood there for a long moment, his hand still tingling from the grip. Ida came up beside him. What did he say? Vernon shook his head. Nothing important. But it was important. It meant they weren't invisible anymore. Weren't just two old fools waiting to die. They were homesteaders, survivors, people who had earned their place on this land through blood and sweat and sheer refusal to quit. April brought rain. Not the violent storms of winter, but gentle, steady rain that soaked into the earth and made things grow. Within 2 weeks, the first shoots appeared. Tiny green points pushing up through the soil. Vernon saw them first. He called Ida over, his voice urgent. She came running, thinking something was wrong, but when she saw what he was pointing at, she stopped, stared, then knelt in the mud and touched one of the shoots with her fingertip. It was real. It was growing. They had done it. The corn grew slowly. Some shoots died. Others withered in dry spells, but most survived. Most thrived. By late April, the field was a patchwork of green, rows of young corn reaching toward the sun. It wouldn't be a large harvest, wouldn't make them rich, but it would be theirs. Proof that they could survive here, that they could make this land produce, that they weren't just clinging to life, but building one. They rebuilt the lean-to in May. Not the same as before, smaller, simpler, but functional, enough to store tools and protect supplies, enough to feel like progress. Vernon worked on it every day, his shoulders still weak but getting stronger. Ida helped when she could, but more often she tended the corn, pulling weeds, watching for pests, watering when the rain didn't come. The work was constant, exhausting, but it was good work, the kind that led somewhere, the kind that had meaning. By early June, other homesteaders began to stop by. Not many, just a few. People who had seen them through the winter, who had expected to find their claim abandoned come spring. But it wasn't abandoned. It was alive, and that meant something to people who understood how hard survival was, how close the edge was. They didn't say much, just nodded, offered a word or two. Good corn. Nice work on the house. Small things, but to Ida and Vernon, they felt like victory. One evening in late June, they sat outside the sod house watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink and purple, colors so vivid they looked unreal. The air was warm, not hot, just warm, pleasant. The kind of evening that made you forget, for a moment, how hard the winter had been. Vernon reached over and took Ida's hand. She looked at him. His face was still gaunt, still marked by the months of struggle. But there was something different in his eyes now, something lighter. "We did it," he said. She nodded. "We did." But it wasn't triumph in her voice. It was something quieter, more complex, because they had survived, yes. But survival had cost them. It had taken their strength, their health, their illusions about what was possible at their age. They had made it through, but they were not the same people who had arrived in October. They had been broken down, rebuilt, changed by the land and the cold and the hunger into something harder, something more resilient, but also something more fragile. They had learned their limits, learned that willpower alone wasn't enough, that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford, that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. The harvest came in September. It wasn't much, maybe 30 bushels, enough to feed them through the winter with some left over to sell or trade, enough to prove that next year could be better, enough to justify the suffering, Vernon and Ida worked side by side, cutting the stalks, shucking the corn, storing it in the lean-to. It took a week. By the end, they were exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from work completed, from goals met, from survival earned. When it was finished, they stood in the field, looking at the stubble where the corn had been. The land looked tired, spent, like them, but it had given them what they needed, and next year it would give more. "We should celebrate," Vernon said. Ida looked at him, surprised. They had nothing to celebrate with. No whiskey, no sugar for a cake, nothing special. But Vernon smiled, a rare thing these days. "We're alive," he said. "That's enough." That night, they ate corn boiled in water, seasoned with salt, and it tasted better than any meal they'd had in months. They talked about the spring, about what they would plant, about fixing the roof properly, about maybe building a real barn, small plans, practical plans, the kind that didn't reach too far, but pointed toward a future that felt possible, reachable, real. As fall turned to winter again, they were better prepared. They had food, fuel stored, the house was warmer, the lean-to stood firm, and they knew what to expect, knew how bad it could get. That knowledge was its own kind of armor. When the first snow came in November, they watched it fall from inside their house and didn't panic, didn't fear. They just watched and waited and trusted that they would make it through. The neighbors stopped calling them the old couple, started calling them by their names, Ida and Vernon Haskell, homesteaders, the ones who survived. It wasn't fame, wasn't fortune, but it was recognition, respect, a place in the community that they had earned through suffering and stubbornness and refusal to quit. And that mattered, maybe more than anything else. Years later, when people asked Vernon how they did it, how two people in their 60s managed to survive that first winter, he would pause, think, then say something simple. "We just didn't stop." And it was true. They hadn't stopped. Not when it was hard, not when it hurt, not when every logical part of them screamed to give up. They had kept moving, kept working, kept breathing, and that had been enough. Not because they were special, not because they were stronger than others, but because they refused to let the land win, refused to let age or cold or hunger or pain define them. They had chosen difficult freedom over comfortable constraint, had chosen to try and fail, rather than never try at all. And in the end, they hadn't failed. They had survived. And survival, on the Kansas prairie in 1886, was its own kind of triumph. The legacy they left wasn't in the land. The claim would be sold eventually, passed to others, forgotten. But the legacy was in the act itself. In the choice to begin at 60, to risk everything for the chance at something more, to prove that it's never too late to start over, never too late to fight for what you believe in, never too late to refuse to go quietly into the comfortable death of routine and safety and acceptance. They had bled for their freedom, suffered for their dignity. And in the end, they had won, not because they succeeded in building something grand, but because they survived. And sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. Have you ever chosen the hard path when the easy one was right there? Have you ever started something when everyone told you it was too late? Have you ever refused to give up even when every part of you wanted to quit? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear about the time you decided that trying and failing was better than never trying at all. Tell me about your difficult freedom, about the thing you fought for when the world said you shouldn't. Because those stories matter. Those choices matter. And maybe, just maybe, someone needs to hear yours today.